Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on Teach Right Podcast. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes, and we're going to be discussing how Matthew and Luke used and redacted the Gospel of Mark. So thank you for joining me today, Frank.
Well, it's my pleasure. This week coming up is not anywhere near as busy as last week was.
All right, so let's get right into the slides. So Frank, you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, if you can go to the first slide, I want to tell you my presuppositions. First of all, that the oral traditions of the words and works of Jesus preceded the writing down of these traditions. And so the diverse set of traditions, which were probably different in different cities, continued to exist after the writing of the Gospels. And the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a literary relationship with each other. I believe in Markan priority. And I think that Q is really possible. I think I'm not always convinced of the Q hypothesis, but now and then the Q hypothesis seems probable. My problem with Q is I just really don't know what Q was. And so it's hard to have firm opinions about Q because I just don't know what it was. And so I think it's clearly a possibility, but I'm not really sure how probable the existence of Q was. And also there could have been more than one edition of Q, as has been argued. So if we could go on to the next slide. The Synoptic Gospels are related to each other because they have the large majority of their material in common. And so that to me is not really disputable. The issue is how and why are the Synoptic Gospels related to each other? You can observe that Matthew has 28 chapters, Mark has 16 chapters, and Luke has 24 chapters. And therefore, Matthew and Luke are considerably longer than Mark. Luke, by the way, is the longest document in the New Testament. Now, if you go on to the next slide, you would see that if you count by verses, and the verses didn't really exist, the verse numbers didn't exist until about the 16th century. But you can see that Matthew has over 1,000 verses. Mark has between 600 and 700 verses, and Luke has over 1,100 verses. And yet, when you compare the verses of these three Gospels, you see that only 31 verses of Mark are not also found in Matthew or Luke, or both Matthew and Luke. So let's go on. And so if you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you will see that Matthew is a little more dependent on Mark than Luke is. And approximately 220 to 235 verses are in common between Matthew and Luke, but are not found in Mark. And of course, when you look at the Greek text in the synopsis, and it's verbatim or almost verbatim between Matthew and Luke in a non-Markan passage, then that moves you in the direction, or I think it should move you in the direction of believing that Q was a written document that did exist. So let's go on. The order, I think, I disagree with the late Bill Farmer. I think the argument from order is actually quite important. Where Matthew and Luke have Mark material in common, it's always in the Markan order. When either Matthew or Luke diverges from the Markan order, the other one seems not to diverge from the Markan order. That to me is quite significant. Matthew and Luke are written in what has often been referred to as better Greek than Mark. And Matthew likes to correct Mark's Greek, or kind of make Mark's Greek a little less awkward than sometimes it is. So that, I think, is significant, especially I think that speaks in favor of Markan priority. If you can go on now. There's a very famous miracle story in the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac. If you look in Mark 5, 1 through 20, you will see all the extremely, I don't want to say gory, but extremely graphic details of how crazy this man is in Mark 5, 1 through 20. And Luke edits it somewhat, but he leaves most of the graphic details in, but he edits it somewhat. And Matthew edits it a whole bunch. Instead of focusing on the how crazy and how demon possessed this poor man was, Matthew focuses on the results of Jesus exorcising the demon or demons out of this man. And so it's a much shorter miracle story in Matthew 8 than it is in Mark 5. But mostly the relatively graphic, well, quite graphic details of all of the things that this man does are pretty much gone in Matthew. And so that is a very famous miracle story. If you happen to teach miracle stories and you are very much a form critic of miracle stories, as I am, you like this miracle story because this miracle story's got everything in it. Okay, let's go on. One of the interesting ones is in Mark 6, 45 to 52. This is number 147 in Kurt Aland's synopsis. And what is really very interesting in this one is that in Mark 6, you have Jesus walking on the water. And so that's great. That's a miracle. And then he gets in the boat. And then Matthew, in Matthew 14, starting at verse 27, Peter talks to Jesus. He's not sure, apparently not sure who Jesus is, but says, "If it really is you, bid me come to you on the sea." So then Jesus allows Peter to walk on the water. He participates in the miracle. And then that's fine until Peter started doubting. And then when Peter started doubting, Peter starts sinking. And so what happens is what started out as a miracle story in Mark 6 sounds a lot like a discipleship story in Matthew 14. And so that's a very interesting case of Matthean redaction of a Markan miracle story. And then there is a parallel also in John 6, 16 through 21. But you'll find it in Kurt Aland's synopsis at section 147. And of course, you can see that it just kind of jumps out at you. It kind of jumps out at you in the synopsis, the part that is in Matthew there, that's not in Mark and not in Luke. Look at the left column in Matthew. That's what Matthew adds, and it's not in Mark and it's not in Luke. And so that sort of jumps out at you, and that's a pretty obvious case of Matthean redaction. Let's go on to the next slide. You also have to pay attention to some of the literary characteristics of Matthew and Luke. Luke is the first volume of a 2-volume work, and the second volume is Acts. Acts may well have been written significantly later than Luke. One of the things that is important to Luke and Acts, especially Acts, as well as the theology of Matthew, is the great emphasis on the Gentile mission of the church. In Matthew, the first worshipers of Jesus are Gentiles, pagan magicians. And at the very end of Matthew, you have go into all the world and preach the gospel to the goyim, the nations, the ethne. And so both Luke and also Matthew are really quite interested in the Gentile mission of the church, but they approach this in different ways. Also, the birth and infancy narratives and the resurrection appearance stories in Matthew and Luke do not match each other. Of course, the genealogies don't match. And of course, just because Matthew and Luke have two common sources, Mark and Q, that does not disallow them from having used other sources which are different from Mark and different from Q. And some of these sources may be, for example, I certainly think Matthew 23, the woes against the scribes and Pharisees, I certainly think that is a separate Promethean source. So you have to, when you look at source criticism or you try to do source criticism, you have to try to identify the sources that you can, and you also have to be open to the fact that there may also be sources that you cannot really identify. Let's go on to the next. And of course, there are major commentaries on Matthew. There's a wonderful 3-volume commentary on Matthew by the late Ulrich Lutz, who taught in Switzerland and also taught in Göttingen. And then Davies and Allison's wonderful 3-volume commentary in the ICC is available in paperback, and I consult it regularly. Bob Gundry's commentary on Matthew is very well worth having. And also Rudolf Schnackenberg's short commentary on Matthew is very, very well worth having. All 4 of those are really excellent and very recent. Let's go on. What's important is that, you know, if you believe in Markan priority, and I think that is very well established, then that has consequences. And of course, the consequence is that if Matthew had a copy of Mark, that doesn't mean that we should think that Matthew would have just copied from it and boom, that's all there is to it. So Matthew can put things together, and Matthew can use Markan stories and do different things. And of course, the story of the walking on the water from Mark 6 is an excellent example of how Matthew transformed a Markan miracle story. Let's go on to the next. And you can see that Matthew used Markan miracle stories and was indeed very interested in them. And of course, you can see there's a bunch of miracle stories in Mark, and Matthew used them. So they illustrate for the reader of Matthew that Jesus is the Son of God. I think it is well established that Matthew's favorite Christological title is that Jesus is Son of God. So Matthew uses the Markan miracle stories to show that that Jesus really had this divine power during his earthly life. Let's go on. And then you can see that Can we go on to the next slide? There it is. Of course, one of the things that Matthew does is that Matthew uses Mark as the skeleton, so to speak, of the Gospel of Matthew. And then Matthew inserts significant teaching material into Matthew. The most famous block of teaching material in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Clearly, it is not from Mark, and it may come from Q. And irrespective of what source it came from, this material seems to be a carefully edited selection of presumably authentic material from Jesus, which came to Matthew through Jewish Christianity. You'll remember that in the Sermon on the Mount, it says anyone who is an outsider, they are to be treated as a Gentile and a tax collector. So the Sermon on the Mount has a very strongly Jewish Christian emphasis in that the outsiders are Gentiles and tax collectors. Whereas in some of the quote unquote really Matthean parts, the Gentiles are indeed not so bad. For example, the Great Commission in Matthew 28. Let's go on to the next. In an important sense, the addition of so much teaching material by Matthew from Q or from other pre-Matthean sources tells us what the final editor of Matthew probably thought was lacking in the Gospel of Mark. Markan miracle stories are edited by Matthew by leaving out some of the more graphic details of exorcism or healings, and by emphasizing the faith of the person being healed and also Jesus' teaching. The miracle stories, as Matthew handles them, seem to emphasize the growing faith of the disciples. And of course, that's precisely what you see in the walking on the water story in Matthew. It emphasizes, okay, Jesus did the miracle by, it was a nature miracle. Jesus could walk on the water and he got in the boat. But then Peter still wasn't sure it was really Jesus. And so Jesus allowed him to name the proof, namely, bid me come to you on the water. And so he does. And then when Peter is lacking in faith, then Peter starts sinking. So that, you see, is a very important, it shows that Matthew has a lot of respect for the miracle stories. Matthew probably thinks these miracle stories go back to the historical Jesus. And yet Matthew is willing to edit them in the direction of showing and emphasizing the faith of the disciples. If you would go on, probably the most important redaction of Mark is in Matthew 16, 13 through 20, which redacts Mark 8, 27 and following with a parallel in Luke. In Mark 8, this is called the Confession of Peter. Mark 8 has Peter, Jesus says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are Ho Christos, the Messiah. And Luke has, you are the Messiah of God. So Luke, that parallel in Luke confirms that you are the Messiah, at least you are the Messiah, was in the source, and the source being Mark. Whereas Matthew starts editing it at 16b of Matthew. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. You see, Son of God is the favored Christological title. And then it follows, it gives you Matthew 16, 17 through 19, in which Simon is being given the name Petros. You are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. And then he is given the power of the keys. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loose in heaven. And so that gives the Matthew, and by extension, the rest of the apostles, tremendous authority in the church. And so those are two of the really big deals for Matthew, that Jesus is Son of God during his earthly life, and that Peter and the apostles are the teachers of the church, and they have tremendous authority in the church. And that stands in a good bit of contrast with the way Mark deals with the apostles, which is not too positive, to put it mildly. Let's go on. And so the apostles in Matthew become mathetai primarily. They were apostoloi in Mark mostly, and they become mathetai. Now, manthano is to teach, and a mathetes is a disciple or a student. And so what happens is the apostles become primarily students in Matthew. They witness and experience Jesus' teaching ministry. And presumably this is so that they will be able to oversee the teaching in Jesus-believing communities after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So that's a real big shift in emphasis, to say the least. We can go on to the next. And so there are some themes in the gospel according to Matthew that are a little bit different than Mark. Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament scripture. Remember the Matthew quotation formula. These things happen in order to fulfill the scripture, the prophet so-and-so saying blank, right? That's only in that quotation formula is only in Matthew. And in contrast to Mark, Matthew thinks that the church is a good thing. And the original disciples of Jesus were basically worthy people. Jesus was understood to be a really great teacher, and his disciples, mathetai, students, understood what Jesus taught. And part of the Great Commission is that the apostles, the disciples, are supposed to teach, go into all the world and preach the gospel and teach whatsoever things I have commanded you. Let's go on to the next. And so there is an emphasis on the Jewish roots of Jesus. And Matthew, like Mark and Luke and John, portrays Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, as basically hypocritical, very opposed to Jesus and his movement, and plotters and collaborators with the Roman occupation government in an attempt to get rid of Jesus and his movement. Let's go on to the next. And so you can see that there are elements at Matthew which emphasize the Jewishness of Jesus, including his genealogy and the repeated use of Matthew's quotation formula. The Sermon on the Mount as a whole has a strongly Jewish ring. The woes in Matthew 23 refers to the division of the cup into two parts, for which there is an excellent parallel in rabbinic material. Now, in the rabbinic material, in Jacob Neusner's famous article, there is the inside of the cup, there's the outside of the cup, and the place where you hold the cup. But nonetheless, the division of the cup into two parts certainly has a very strongly Jewish ring to it. Let's go on. And so, to most current New Testament scholars, Christian and Jewish and whatever, the controversies with Jesus, by Jesus, with the scribes and the Pharisees in the Gospels, they don't sound like Jesus being anti-Jewish. Rather, they sound to most of us these days as inner Jewish debates. And there's a good reason for that. And the main reason is that there was no normative Judaism in the first century. The Dead Sea Scrolls, along with other documents, show us that Judaism in this time was very diverse. And Martin Hengel's justly famous book, Judaism and Hellenism, showed how many elements of Judaism in Jesus' time had been thoroughly Hellenized. So Judaism was a very mixed bag in Jesus' time, as we now know. We can go on to the next. Also, there's a couple of themes that are interesting in Matthew. Matthew brings in this theme all from himself, really. According to Matthew, the church was a corpus per mixtum, to use Martin Luther's famous phrase. There are people in the church that are the sincere followers of Jesus, and there are other people in the church that are not. And this is the way it is in the present age. And in the age to come, God's going to sort those people out. So God and the angels will do the sorting out, and that's what the parable of the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares, is all about, which is specifically Matthean. Let's go on. Another Matthean theme is Matthew is interested in the salvation of Gentiles. You see that in the story of the Magi in Matthew 2, and also the Great Commission in Matthew 28, and also the condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees in 23:13 for their activities, which actually help to exclude people from the kingdom of God. And so the Gentile mission is a significant Matthean theme. Let's go on. And then, of course, how did Luke use Mark? If you want to know how Luke used Mark, you've got to read Joseph Fitzmyer's commentary on page 67 of the first volume. In that, Luke takes Markan material in large blocks, and this is in big contrast with Matthew. In Mark 1 through 15, you have all of that being pretty much reproduced in Luke 3 and 4. And then in Mark 1:21 to 3:19, which is the beginnings of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, you have that in Luke 4, 5, and 6. You have more material in Mark 4 through 9 that's reproduced in 8 and 9. And of course, as we know in Luke 9:51, until Jesus gets into Jerusalem in about 1827, you have the travel narrative. And in the travel narrative, there's virtually no Markan material, but there is a great deal of material in which a whole bunch of teaching material in big blocks comes through between Luke 9:51 and about Luke 18:27. And there are a couple of other big blocks, including the Passion narrative in Mark 14 and 15, plus the empty tomb story in Mark 16, and then this is reproduced in Luke 22, 23, and 24, which includes the Passion narrative in Luke and the resurrection appearances. So we can go on to the next. And so there are three parables that these three parables are not Markan, but nonetheless, they illustrate the creativity of Luke. Because in Luke 15, 1 through 7, you have this would appear, if there is Q, this would appear to be a Q passage. This is the parallel in Matthew 18. And so Luke 15, 1 through 7 is the parable of the lost sheep. What do you do if you're a shepherd and you've lost a sheep? Well, you leave 99 on the hillside and you go to look for the one that's lost. And then in two parables which have no parallels at all, you have the parable of the lost coin, which emphasizes God sees things that are lost, and God is like the old woman who loses the silver coin, who really searches for the silver coin, and when she finds it, everyone rejoices, right? And then, of course, the real masterpiece is the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. And so these two parables, the lost coin and the lost son, underline the parable of the lost sheep, which Luke got either from Matthew or from Q. And so that shows you the ability that Luke has to bring in other material. And the big question that you have is this a Luke? Are these two other stories, the lost coin and the prodigal son, are they Lucan compositions, or were they there from other sources? But they certainly look to me like they're Lucan compositions. But anyway, you can see that the way that Luke used the Q parable of the lost sheep and then added to it by adding the parable of the lost coin and then the parable of the lost son, that illustrates the creativity of Luke. Let's go on to the next. Well, that's about it.
Yep.
So that is it. So I've said too much, but this is the way I think about the ways that Matthew and Luke use Mark. In particular, this, of course, went back to redaction criticism. In this book, this was the great book on the redaction of Matthew. It was called Tradition and Interpretation in Matthew by Günter Bornkamm of the University of Heidelberg and two of his students. And then there's also a really good book, if you don't have it, by Christopher Tuckett of Oxford University, and it's called Reading the New Testament, Methods of Interpretation. And there's a good brief section on redaction criticism between pages 116 to 135. So that would be a great way to learn more about several different ways of looking at the New Testament by a master.
All right, let's take a couple of super chat questions. We'll start with Adia Morgenstern. Thank you for your super chat. Could one infer agendas for Matthew and Luke based on the verses they apparently chose to omit?
I certainly think in the Matthean redaction of the Gerasene demoniac story from Mark 5, 1 through 20, the agenda for Matthew is that he wants to focus attention on the results of Jesus healing the man. He wants to focus attention rather away from the fact that the man had 6,000 thousands of demons. My name is Legion, for we are many. He wants to focus attention away from the obvious parallels with magic, and focus more on Jesus' power to do the miracles and Jesus' compassion on the man. So Matthew wants to keep the story of Jesus a little tighter, perhaps, than Mark does. Matthew omits less of Mark than Luke does. But when Luke uses Mark in big blocks, as Fitzmyer shows. So I think what you really have to do is that you really have to get going with the synopsis, either in English or preferably in Greek. Kurt Allen's synopsis, I think, is the better one to use. And you have to read the Markan story, and then you have to see, okay, what does Matthew do to this? And then when you look at the very few, there's only 31 verses of Mark that are not in Matthew or Luke or both. So I think you have to look at the stories. You can look at what's omitted, and then I think you have to, think for yourself, why would you omit this story? And that's the best I can do. But the way that I look at Matthew is that Matthew wants to keep it tighter, and he wants to focus emphasis on Jesus as a teacher, and focus emphasis perhaps a little bit away on Jesus as a healer, since that could be so radically misinterpreted perhaps, as Jesus as a magician. Matthew doesn't want Jesus to be a magician. Matthew wants Jesus to be Son of God. And the reason that Jesus does the miracles is because they illustrate the compassion that God has for these people that need the miracles. And also it illustrates the power that Jesus has as Son of God during his earthly life.
Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. Given Q is based on Matthew and Luke's commonalities, how is Q ordered? Based on Matthew or Luke or the sensibilities of the storyline?
Well, those who are people who study Q tend to think, they do think, that the more primitive um, form of Q, given that they believe that Q existed, the more primitive form of Q is what you find in Luke. And that is not hard to believe, given the way we can see Luke uses Markan material in bigger blocks. Whereas Matthew likes to more or less slice and dice a word here, a word there, a few verses left out. And so I think that you can really primarily look at Q and look at the way Luke uses it and exactly what the order of things in Q was. I do not think that we necessarily have all of Q. And of course, Q being, if Q existed, Q was a sayings gospel, like the Gospel of Thomas, which of course we do have. And the Gospel of Thomas, being a sayings gospel, is like sayings strung together like pearls on a string, which doesn't, to me, seem to have a storyline. It seems to be just they're strung together. Of course, Q, if Q did exist, it seems to begin with John the Baptist. But on the other hand, look at some of the things that Q apparently didn't have, namely a passion narrative or anything about the meaning of the death of Jesus. And also, Q didn't have anything about the resurrection. So it's easier to talk about what Q appeared to have had than what Q seems to have had. We only know Q to the extent that we know Q from what is presumably quoted, possibly with some editing, in Luke and Matthew. So I don't know that it's possible to talk about a storyline in Luke. In Q. That's the kind of thing that I would ask John Kloppenborg about.
What do you make of the minor agreements? Some who think Q didn't exist as a written document or unsure if it existed at all, or if it was an oral source or not, think that Luke knew Matthew because the minor agreements that they have against Mark is evidence that one knew the other.
Well, just because we have manuscripts of Mark from, the basically Codex Vaticanus is 4th century and Alexandrinus is 5th century and Sinaiticus is 4th century. And then we have significant bits and pieces of Mark in the papyri. Why assume that all of the manuscripts of Mark were the same in the 2nd century church? Assuming Mark goes back to the late 1st century, and then you have the 2nd century. We can look. If Matthew and Luke both use Q, nonetheless, look how different Matthew and Luke are. So why assume that the manuscripts of Mark going back into the 2nd century, which we essentially don't have, why assume that they were all the same in every city? And so what could be in manuscripts of Mark or in a manuscript of Mark in one city might very well not be in a manuscript of Mark in another city, and so forth. And so when I was taking the course on text criticism, the understanding that Ernie Saunders had, and he was a student of Kenneth Clark, the understanding that he had, and I think he got it from F.J.A. Hort, is that so many of the variant readings got into the manuscripts of the New Testament in the 2nd century. And remember, Hort looked at variant readings very carefully, and he thought that the more original reading would be the reading that would frequently be the more difficult reading. The more difficult reading would be the reading that would give rise to the readings elsewhere in the tradition. In other words, because a certain phrase or something was difficult, that's why it would be rewritten in the manuscript tradition. So, Westcott and Hort in 1881 came out with their Greek New Testament, and they called it the New Testament in the original Greek. Nobody would use that title today, because we don't know what circulated in the 1st and 2nd centuries. We can only estimate that. And so what we have, based on the great uncials and now based on some of the papyri, we have the text. We can probably reconstruct the text that circulated in the 4th century, maybe a little bit before that. But we don't know what circulated in the 2nd century church. But if you believe what Streeter was talking about in his book, The Four Gospels, A Study of Origins, he was drawing on F.J.A. Hort's theory of local texts, and that different cities may well have had local texts. And if you remember that chart from Streeter, in other words, Mark was pretty much from Rome, and Proto-Luke was from here, and Luke was from there, and Matthew was from there. And so Hort believed in a theory of local texts. So I think that there are also a lot of really good scholars have always believed in Mark-Q overlaps. Frederick Grant, F.C. Grant, in his book, The Gospels, Their Origin and Their Growth, believed in Q-Mark overlaps. And so I think that Streeter has it right when he calls them minor agreements. And of course, Streeter was opposed to the Ur-Marcus hypothesis, but I don't think the Ur-Marcus hypothesis was all wrong. I don't think that we can assume that Mark always was in the same form as the form we have it now.
What is your current stance on Q? You've pointed out on this show and on prior episodes that you're not exactly always sure if there was a Q or not. What do you make of the idea that Luke knew Matthew in that case?
Well, I think the Luke, in other words, the Farrer hypothesis, in other words, Markan priority, and then Matthew had a copy of Mark, and then Luke had a copy of Mark and Matthew, or just Matthew maybe. I think that that's a possibility. That's a possibility. But on the other hand, there are some significant differences between Luke and Matthew. The resurrection appearances are different. The Sermon on the Mount is quite different. It's different in context, and it's different in in Luke you have blessed are you poor, and then in Matthew we have blessed are the poor in spirit. A lot has been written about that. The resurrection appearances are different. The birth stories of Jesus with the angels and the shepherds in Luke. The first worshipers are Jews, And in Matthew, the first worshipers of Jesus are the pagan astrologers. So I think that the problem with Luke using Matthew as opposed to Luke having Q is how different Matthew and Luke are in passages that you might expect them to be the same, given that both Matthew and Luke are very interested in the resurrection, and yet their resurrection stories are different. Both of them are interested in Jesus' roots, and yet the genealogies are extremely different. So that to me speaks against the Farrar hypothesis. So no hypothesis is going to satisfy everybody. I do think that when push comes to shove, you are always going to be left with the around 230 verses common to Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. And I think we can talk about them as a source. Of course, Dieter Luhrmann, in his book Die Redaktion der Logienquelle, the redaction of Q, argued that there was editing of Q before Matthew got to it, and maybe Luke got to it. So there could be editing of Q. And as we know, early Christian writers love to edit each other's texts. So I don't think that you can rule out the editing of Q that could explain the differences between Matthew and Luke in apparently Q passages. But I also wonder if too much has been sometimes claimed for Q. And so it's one thing to speak of Q as a source, a theoretical source. It's another thing to speak of Q as a gospel. I'm very comfortable with speaking of it as a theoretical source. And I'm just not sure about it as a gospel.
And when do you think, if assuming Q existed, when do you think it was composed? When would you date it? Before Mark, after Mark, around the same time as Mark?
I'm one of those people that think that Mark is after 70. In other words, look at the first couple of verses in Mark 13, look at the big stones, etc. And Jesus says, I tell you, not one stone will be on top of the other stone. And I see that as ex eventu prophecy of the Jewish war. And I think that the Q material doesn't reflect anything like that. The Q material, if there is Q, looks like it could be a lot of Jesus sayings which circulated in the early church. And they could circulate in different ways in different cities. And so I think the Q material could be earlier than even Paul's letters, which are both mostly in the 50s. They could be around the same time. I would think that people are likely to have gotten really interested in these specific sayings of Jesus as they begin to realize the apostles are dying. Human life being what it is, the apostles were dying. And by the end of the first century, you would certainly expect that the apostles were dead. And so I think that the early church had every reason to try to preserve as much of the teaching of Jesus as they could. And so different churches or different Jesus communities could have put together compendia of the sayings of Jesus that would be for their community. The John the Baptist stuff is very interesting indeed. So I think that there could be different collections of Jesus sayings in different communities. And so they might not have come together originally at the same time or even in the same city. And yet eventually, eventually, if the Q hypothesis is correct, then you would have Matthew and Luke using them in probably the late first century, most likely the late first century, if not the early second century. So the Q material is very hard to date. You know, we date Pauline letters because we can date Paul, and we can have some idea of Paul's travels and when Paul founded churches, that sort of thing. And the Q material being primarily sayings material, and of course the parallels have been drawn between Q material and wisdom collections. That means in wisdom literature is very, very difficult to date because you just don't have local details that allow you to have any confidence about your dating.
And what do you make of the idea that Mark knew Q? And this has to do with the Mark Q overlaps.
I think Mark had access to oral tradition. Mark had access to oral tradition that was probably still in its oral form, whereas Q had access to oral tradition, and Q was an attempt, or maybe several attempts, to write down the oral tradition of the sayings of Jesus. And so there could be oral traditions, you know, doublets of of essentially the same sayings that could get to Mark and could find their way into Matthew and Luke in two different ways. And so that is the characteristic of oral tradition, is how difficult it is to pin down.
And then my last question, do you think that the sayings of Jesus in Q are authentic to the historical Jesus, or do you doubt some or all of them?
I think that a substantial part of them are very likely to be have come from the historical Jesus. On the other hand, for example, when you have material that is peculiar to Luke, especially in the Lucan travel narrative, especially, for example, the parable of the prodigal son, especially the parable of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16:19-31. I have argued in print that is a Lucan composition. So just because you can show that the Matthew and Luke, and for that matter Mark, have stuff that they get from earlier tradition, that does not gainsay the possibility of them putting together material and putting it in the right place so that it underlines what they want to underline. For example, the parable of the lost sheep, which is from Matthew, could be Q, and then Luke's addition of the lost coin and then the lost son. So I think that you can't just make a blanket statement about it's either from Jesus or it's not from Jesus. But when you look at material that's in Luke, and it's also in Matthew, and it's also in Mark, then maybe that gives you a little bit more confidence that this is likely to come from the historical Jesus. And when you look at material that is only in Luke, and when you can see that it seems to be kind of added to for emphasis, that would point you in the direction, as it points me in the direction, of saying this looks like a Lucan composition. And I certainly do think the lost coin and the lost sheep, the parable of the prodigal son, those look to me like Lucan compositions. And I have certainly argued in print for the parable of Lazarus and the rich man being a Lucan composition. So I think that you have to work in the synopsis for years, and maybe you get a feel for the sources. But I think that some of the material, it makes historical sense to me that, I mean, Jesus must have taught something. right? And so it makes sense to me that if you can show that it's firmly a part of the Synoptic Gospel tradition, standing behind Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then you're moving it closer historically and literarily to Jesus. If you can look at some materials that is not anywhere other than Luke, or it's not anywhere other than the final editor of Matthew, or if it's only in one source and that source looks kind of late, then that speaks against it coming from the historical Jesus, perhaps. So that is kind of subjective, isn't it?
Yep. So I have a link to Frank Hughes' book, The Corinthian Correspondence, in the description below if you want to go buy it, and also a link to Rust and Redeemer, which the Rust and Redeemer YouTube channel, which posts many of Frank's recordings on that channel, in which he gives lectures on Paul and the Gospels. That being said, thank you for joining me today, Frank.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure. You can see I'm dressed the same way as I was this morning.
Yep. All right. Let me go ahead and end it. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.